This billionaire heiress faked her own kidnapping, but here's the crazy part. She thought she'd escape her father's control with a staged abduction, but when real rebels hijacked her fake plan, everything spiraled out of control. Now, she's taking on her own family in a high-stakes battle that could cost her much more than just her life. Trust me, the ending of this drama will shock you with a no-way ending. I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. The city sparkled beneath a dusky haze as Isabella Izzy Laurent leaned on the balcony rail of her father's penthouse, gazing out over the skyline with restless eyes. She'd spent countless evenings here, watching the lights flicker to life, each window a glimmer of possibility. And tonight, every single one seemed to mock her. Tomorrow was her engagement party, a grand event orchestrated by her father with a guest list stacked with influential names from across Europe. And the groom-to-be? Charles Remington, her father's choice. Wealthy, polished, powerful, everything her father approved of, and everything Izzy resented. Izzy clenched her fists, her pulse thudding with the thought of spending her life tethered to a man she hardly knew, all for the sake of her family's legacy. But it wasn't the engagement itself that made her stomach churn. It was the betrayal, the sense that her father, a man who prided himself on loyalty, had decided to give her away like a prized possession. Turning away from the view, Izzy let the cool breeze steady her as she pulled out her phone and read the message for the 100th time. It's set. Tomorrow morning. You're ready? She inhaled deeply, feeling the spark of exhilaration mix with fear. She was more than ready. For months, she had been planning this escape, piecing it together in secret, reaching out to people who knew people, the kinds of people she'd been taught never to associate with. But desperate times had led her to desperate measures. She replied with one word: ready. Sliding her phone into her purse, she gave herself one last glance in the mirror. She could still walk away from this, save herself the risk, the unknown. But then she imagined the empty life stretched before her, an existence spent on display, the obedient daughter, the compliant wife, a mere accessory to someone else's success. The thought made her skin prickle. Izzy lifted her chin. No more second thoughts. It was now or never. On the next morning, Izzy wore her usual impeccable mask as she descended the grand staircase for breakfast, ignoring her father's pleased gaze. He was already seated, a neatly pressed newspaper in hand, sipping his black coffee with the controlled precision he applied to everything. "Good morning, Isabella," he greeted, barely looking up. She flashed a quick smile. "Morning, father." As she took her seat, her heart hammered under the cool facade she'd perfected over the years. Today, he was more polite than usual, his manner brisk and businesslike. He was pleased. His plan to marry her off to Remington had gone exactly as he'd hoped. "Charles will be joining us for dinner tonight," he said, dabbing the corner of his mouth. "I trust you'll be ready to make a favorable impression?" She forced a smile, hoping he couldn't see the storm brewing beneath her calm. "Of course," her father continued, oblivious to her rising nerves. "Remember, Isabella, this is about our legacy. You have a duty to uphold. Duty." The word echoed in her mind, and she clenched her hands under the table. He'd never understood, never cared to understand, her dreams, her own desires. To him, she was just another part of the Laurent empire, a pawn to be positioned for maximum gain. The silence that followed was deafening. It was her cue to speak, to agree, to assure him of her obedience. But she didn't. Instead, she gave him a thin smile and excused herself, muttering something about needing to prepare for the evening. As she left, her father's voice drifted behind her, sharp and certain. "Remember who you are, Isabella. Don't forget what we stand for." She bit back a bitter laugh. "Oh, I remember who I am, father. But tonight, you'll see who I'm about to become." Hours later, she slipped out of the penthouse with a small bag slung over her shoulder, filled with only the essentials. Her pulse thundered as she moved quietly down the back stairwell, her fingers shaking slightly as she gripped the railing. Her driver was waiting for her by the car in the alley below. Izzy had paid him handsomely, and he didn't ask questions. "Are you sure about this, Miss Laurent?" he asked, a trace of concern in his voice as he held the door open for her. Izzy took one last glance up at the towering structure of her family's home, the gilded cage she'd inhabited all her life. The fear she'd been suppressing came rushing up, but with it came the realization of just how much she needed this. Needed to take back her life, no matter the cost. "Yes," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She stepped into the car, and he closed the door behind her. They drove in silence, weaving through the crowded streets of the city until they reached the quieter outskirts. Her heart pounded in time with the passing streetlights as the car finally came to a stop near an abandoned warehouse. She knew the people she'd contacted were waiting inside. She could feel the heat of anticipation tingling through her. The driver gave her a nod. "Good luck, Miss Laurent." With a deep breath, she stepped out, clutching her bag tightly as she crossed the gravel lot toward the looming warehouse. Inside, her contacts waited, the people who would kidnap her and take her somewhere far from her father's reach. Izzy was led into a dimly lit room where two men she'd only ever met by phone were waiting. They were tall, both with an air of practiced calm, and wore the kind of blank expressions that told her they'd done this sort of thing before. The taller one spoke first. "Isabella Laurent, I presume." She gave a curt nod. "It's Izzy." He smirked slightly and she felt a flash of nerves. Was she truly ready for this? But she'd come this far. There was no turning back now. "All right, Izzy," he said, crossing his arms. "You know the plan. We'll get you out of here safely, but once we're on the move, there's no contact with anyone you know. You stay hidden. Understand?" She nodded, trying to swallow the tightness in her throat. The shorter man leaned in, studying her carefully. "You're sure about this? Once you disappear, your life as you know it is over." Izzy met his gaze, a defiant spark in her eyes. "That's exactly what I want." The men exchanged a look before nodding in silent agreement. The tall one pulled out a black cloth, holding it up. "All right then, let's make this look real." Her heart skipped as he approached, and her vision went dark as the cloth slid over her eyes. This was it. No going back. Izzy took a deep breath, feeling her pulse race beneath her calm. As they led her away, she clung to a single, powerful thought that kept her fears at bay. She was finally free. The ride was rougher than Izzy had expected. She couldn't see a thing through the blindfold, but she could sense the winding, narrow roads as the vehicle climbed higher and the air grew colder. Her hands were tied, a precaution she'd agreed to when she devised her plan, but the reality of it all, the darkness, the restraints, the unknown destination, set her heart pounding. She clenched her fists to keep herself calm. This was exactly what she wanted. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. It's supposed to feel real, she reminded herself, biting down on the nerves threatening to overwhelm her. Soon, she would disappear from her father's world entirely. Suddenly, the car screeched to a halt. Izzy lurched forward, her shoulders slamming into the seat in front of her. She caught the muffled sounds of voices outside, agitated, low. Something wasn't right. She strained to hear, catching fragments of what sounded like an argument. Before she could piece it together, her door swung open, and she was yanked out of the car with startling force. She stumbled, the blindfold slipping just slightly as she tried to regain her balance. Who are you?" she stammered, her heart thudding as rough hands held her firmly in place. "Quiet," a new voice ordered, cold and authoritative. There was a pause, and then she felt a tug at her blindfold. A moment later, it was yanked off, and she blinked, squinting in the blinding light of a flashlight directed at her face. Through the glare, she made out the sharp silhouette of a man, tall, lean, with intense dark eyes that watched her, as if she were a strange puzzle he had no time for. He wore a black jacket, half-zipped, and a scarf around his neck, which obscured his face just enough to give him an air of mystery. "Isabella Laurent," he said, his voice rough and cutting. Or should I say, the runaway heiress? The words sent a chill down her spine, but she kept her face blank. "Stay calm. Adapt." "Who are you?" she demanded, injecting as much bravado into her voice as she could muster. But her heart was thundering. She hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected the man in front of her to look so severe, so real. The man raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smirk playing at his lips. "I asked the questions here." He glanced behind him at the men who had brought her, and a flicker of surprise crossed her face. They were tied up, lined against the wall, under the watchful gaze of three strangers dressed in black and armed with knives and firearms. Her team had been intercepted. A sinking feeling grew in her stomach as the man motioned for her to follow him. He didn't bother to explain what was happening, nor did he check to see if she was willing to comply. He simply started walking, expecting her to follow. Izzy hesitated, but the glint of a gun in one of the men's hands told her she didn't have much choice. She moved forward, her thoughts racing. Who were these people? She'd planned her escape meticulously, picked her contacts carefully. How had things spiraled so quickly out of her control? They led her through the trees, her shoes slipping on the loose dirt and stones. After what felt like an eternity, they reached an old building, concealed behind thick clusters of trees. She guessed it was an abandoned farmhouse, judging by the worn exterior and broken windows. The stranger pushed the door open, and she was led into a small, dimly lit room. The man who'd spoken to her stood by the window, his back to her, arms crossed. He didn't say anything, allowing the silence to settle like a weight between them. Izzy waited, feigning calm, but her insides churned with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Finally, he turned around and met her gaze. "I'm Luca Marconi," he said, his voice even, as if they were having a polite introduction. "Leader of a group you'd probably call a threat to your father's empire." Izzy's eyes narrowed. She'd heard his name before, though only in whispers. Luca Marconi was a ghost in her father's world, a name spoken with a hint of fear and respect. He led a faction that challenged powerful elites, seeking to undermine corporations with dark histories and exploitative practices. To her father, he was a dangerous idealist. To the press, a myth. "I don't know who you think I am or why you brought me here," she lied, her chin lifted defiantly. A humorless smile tugged at Luca's lips. "Isabella, let's not play games. We both know why you're here. I know who you are, and I know who your father is. Do you have any idea the amount of leverage I can get from holding you?" Izzy's heart raced, but she kept her face unreadable. "If it's money you want, you'll have to wait in line. My father controls every cent I own." Luca tilted his head, studying her carefully. "Money is just one form of power. I have other ways of making him cooperate." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "The question is, what are you really doing out here, Isabella? A little too convenient to be caught so far from your family's estate with only a pair of hired goons, don't you think?" Izzy's mind whirled. "Careful. Say too much, and he'll know something's off." "I was going to visit friends," she replied coolly, meeting his gaze with all the steel she could muster. "Not that it's any of your business." Luca's eyes held hers for a moment, and she could see he wasn't convinced. Still, he leaned back, as if willing to let her keep her secrets for now. "Here's how it's going to work," he said, folding his arms. "You're going to cooperate with us, willingly or not. You'll do what I say, and we'll see just how much your father values his daughter's safety." Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You won't get a thing from him," she said, her voice laced with defiance. Luca chuckled darkly. "We'll see about that." If you're enjoying the video, please help me by subscribing to the channel. It will make a huge difference and help me a lot. It's amazing what men like your father will give up when their reputation's on the line. Izzy fought back a shiver. She was in far deeper than she'd planned. Her own orchestrated escape now completely beyond her control. Luca Marconi was a force she hadn't anticipated. Intelligent, ruthless, and clearly skilled at reading people. He was watching her now, eyes narrowed, as if he could see straight through her act. "Get comfortable," he said, with a casual wave toward the bare mattress in the corner. "You'll be here for a while." Izzy swallowed, her gaze flicking from the mattress to Luca, whose eyes held an unsettling intensity. She sensed that she was merely a tool to him, a means to an end. And yet, there was something else, something flickering just beneath the surface of his controlled demeanor that made her pulse quicken in a way she couldn't quite explain. As he turned to leave, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. "Good night, Isabella," he said, his voice softer, but still carrying that underlying edge. "I'll see you in the morning." And with that, the door clicked shut, leaving Izzy alone in the silence, her heart pounding as she processed the night's events. Her plans had gone completely awry, but one thing was clear. She was now caught up in Luca Marconi's world, a world she barely understood, but couldn't help feeling drawn to. She sat on the mattress, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Her journey had only just begun, but for the first time, Izzy realized she might be playing a game far more dangerous than she'd bargained for. The faint hum of voices filtered through the thin walls of the farmhouse as Izzy sat on the edge of the creaking mattress. The dawn light seeped through a crack in the boarded-up window, casting fractured shadows across the room. She hadn't slept. How could she? Her mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. The thrill of her escape, the fear of her captors, and the maddening presence of Luca Marconi. Her stomach growled, pulling her back to the present. She scowled, annoyed at the betrayal of her body. Hunger wasn't on her priority list, but if she was going to survive whatever this was, she'd need her strength. The door creaked open without warning, and her pulse jumped. Luca stepped in, carrying a chipped ceramic bowl that looked far older than either of them. He handed it to her without a word, and she caught a glimpse of plain oatmeal topped with a meager slice of dried fruit. "Breakfast," he said simply, leaning against the doorframe. Izzy looked from the bowl to him. Room service could use some work. A corner of Luca's mouth lifted, but his gaze remained sharp. "Eat. You'll need your energy." "For what exactly?" she asked, keeping her tone light but her eyes steady on his. Luca didn't answer. Instead, he crossed his arms, watching as she reluctantly picked up the spoon and took a bite. The oatmeal was bland, but she didn't dare complain. Not with Luca's eyes fixed on her like that, as if he were cataloging her every move. "Where am I?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. "Safe," Luca said curtly. "For now." Izzy set the bowl down, the tension in her chest tightening. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer you're getting," he replied, his tone making it clear he wasn't in the mood for negotiation. "Finish your breakfast, then I'll show you around." Her brows shot up. "What? The grand tour? How generous." Luca's expression darkened, and for a moment, Izzy wondered if she'd pushed too far. But then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "You're in the middle of nowhere," he said, his voice low but firm. "Far from your father. Far from anyone who'd come looking for you. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." Izzy swallowed the retort on the tip of her tongue and focused on finishing the oatmeal. It wasn't worth arguing. Not yet. The farmhouse, as it turned out, wasn't a farmhouse at all. At least, not anymore. What looked like a rundown rural home on the surface was actually a carefully hidden base of operations, complete with hidden rooms, escape routes, and a small but dedicated team of people who seemed to revere Luca like he was some kind of general. Izzy followed Luca through the narrow hallways, her eyes darting to the faces of the people they passed. Some greeted Luca with brief nods, their eyes wary as they glanced at her. Others avoided her altogether, focusing on their tasks with single-minded intensity. They entered a larger room toward the back of the house, where maps and photographs were pinned to the walls, covering nearly every inch of space. A long table in the center of the room was cluttered with papers, radios, and what looked like surveillance equipment. "This is where we plan our operations," Luca said, his tone all business now. He gestured to the maps. "Every red circle you see, that's a point of interest. Places where your father's company has overstepped, exploited, or outright destroyed lives." Izzy frowned, stepping closer to examine the maps. "And what do you do about it?" Luca's jaw tightened. "We expose the truth. We disrupt operations. We fight back." She looked at him, noting the intensity in his expression, the fire in his voice. It was clear he believed in what he was doing, but it was also clear he didn't trust her. Not yet. "And now I'm part of your plan?" she asked, crossing her arms. Luca's eyes narrowed. "Your leverage. Your father won't ignore us if he thinks you're in danger." Izzy bit back a sharp response, her chest tightening. She knew this was the role she'd signed up for, in a way, but it stung to hear it from Luca's mouth, to be reduced to a pawn in his war. "And what happens if he doesn't cooperate?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Luca didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his gaze searching, as if trying to gauge how much she could handle. "That's not something you need to worry about." Izzy felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. "Maybe I should worry about it, considering it's my life on the line." Luca's lips pressed into a thin line. "You wanted out of your father's shadow, didn't you? Well, congratulations. You're out. But now you're in my world, Isabella. And in my world, there's no room for privilege or complaints." Her breath hitched at his words, the weight of them sinking in. She'd wanted freedom, desperately, recklessly, but she hadn't expected it to come like this, wrapped in danger and uncertainty, with a man who seemed as much an enigma as he was a captor. Luca turned away, gesturing for her to follow. "Come on, there's more to see." The day passed in a blur of uneasy introductions and tense silences. Izzy learned more about Luca's team. Some were former journalists, others tech experts or whistleblowers. They were united by a shared disdain for the kind of unchecked power her father represented. Despite herself, Izzy couldn't help but feel a spark of curiosity. She'd spent her entire life in a world of luxury, surrounded by people who played by her father's rules. Seeing this, seeing people willing to risk everything to fight back, was both unsettling and oddly fascinating. But her fascination didn't extend to Luca, not entirely. He was infuriatingly closed off, answering her questions with clipped responses or not at all. And yet, there was something about him that kept her attention. Something in the way he moved, the way he commanded the room without raising his voice. By the time the sun set, Izzy felt the exhaustion settle into her bones. She sat on the edge of the mattress in her room, staring at the faint patterns of moonlight on the floor. A knock at the door made her jump, and Lucas stepped in without waiting for an invitation. He held a small plate with a piece of bread and some cheese, setting it on the table beside her. "Dinner," he said, his tone neutral. Izzy looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Is this how you treat all your hostages?" Lucas smirked, just slightly. "Only the ones who talk too much." Despite herself, Izzy felt a flicker of a smile tug at her lips. But she quickly pushed it down, not wanting to give him the satisfaction. As he turned to leave, she called out to him, "Luca." He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Why do you do this?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Why risk so much?" For a moment, Luca hesitated. His expression softened, just barely, and Izzy caught a glimpse of something deeper, something he didn't often let show. "Because someone has to," he said simply. And then he was gone, leaving Izzy alone with her thoughts, her questions, and the strange, growing pull she felt toward the man who had upended her life. The following days settled into an uneasy routine. Izzy remained confined to the farmhouse, shadowed by the ever-watchful eyes of Luca's team. Every movement she made seemed to draw their suspicion. It wasn't surprising. They didn't know her, and they certainly didn't trust her. But it was Luca's scrutiny that made her stomach churn the most. He was always nearby, his sharp gaze catching even the slightest misstep. And yet, he rarely spoke to her directly, his instructions clipped and impersonal. It should have made him easier to hate, but instead, it had the opposite effect. The more distant he seemed, the more Izzy's curiosity grew. Today was no different. Izzy sat in the corner of the farmhouse's main room, pretending to read one of the worn books she'd found on a shelf. But in truth, her eyes kept drifting to the map-covered walls, to the low murmur of voices from Luca and his inner circle as they planned their next move. "You're staring," a voice interrupted, low and gravelly. Izzy jolted, snapping the book shut as Luca appeared beside her, leaning casually against the table. His dark eyes held a flicker of amusement, though his expression remained guarded. "Am I?" she replied, forcing a smirk. "Maybe I just find your decorating choices uninspired." Luca's lips quirked, but his gaze didn't waver. "And maybe I find your curiosity dangerous." Izzy felt her pulse quicken. "It's not curiosity. It's boredom. There's only so much a girl can do in a place like this." "Then you should be glad I have a job for you," Luca said, straightening. "A job?" Izzy blinked, caught off guard. "What kind of job?" "Something simple," he replied, his tone deceptively light. "I need someone who can make calls, smooth talk a few contacts. Someone who knows how to play the part of a wealthy heiress." Izzy's stomach tightened. "You want me to help you?" "I want you to prove you're more than dead weight," Luca corrected, his voice sharp now. "You've spent your life in boardrooms and gala dinners. Time to put those skills to use." Izzy bit her lip, weighing her options. She hadn't anticipated being dragged into Luca's schemes so directly. But refusing would only raise suspicion, and if she was going to survive this, she needed to stay useful. Besides, part of her was intrigued, a dangerous curiosity about what Luca was planning. "Fine," she said finally. "What do you need me to do?" The task turned out to be more challenging than she'd expected. Luca handed her a burner phone and a list of numbers, contacts who could supply equipment and resources for the group's next mission. Each call required precision, a careful balance of charm and subtle pressure to get what they needed, without raising suspicion. Izzy leaned against the farmhouse's weathered counter, the phone pressed to her ear as she tried to coax a particularly stubborn supplier into cooperating. "I understand your concerns," she said, her voice smooth and confident. "But trust me, this investment will pay off tenfold. Luca's group doesn't fail." She glanced at Luca, who stood across the room, arms crossed as he watched her. His expression was unreadable, but she could feel the weight of his judgment. The supplier hesitated on the other end of the line, and Izzy pushed harder. "If it's about trust, let me assure you, my family name carries weight for a reason. I don't associate with failures." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, a reminder of the Laurent Empire she was trying so hard to escape, but they worked. A moment later, the supplier agreed, and Izzy hung up with a triumphant smirk. "Well?" she said, turning to Luca. "Good enough for you?" Luca's mouth twitched, but he didn't give her the satisfaction of a full smile. "Not bad. Maybe you're not as out of your depth as I thought." "High praise," Izzy replied dryly. but a flicker of satisfaction warmed her chest. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just stepped deeper into a web she didn't fully understand. Lol. But that night, Izzy found herself unable to sleep. The farmhouse was quiet, the team scattered across various rooms in states of exhaustion. But her mind wouldn't stop spinning, replaying the day's events, Luca's cryptic comments, and the growing sense that she was being tested. Unable to sit still, she slipped out of her room and into the darkened hallway. The cool night air seeped through the cracks in the old walls, sending a shiver down her spine as she made her way to the main room. She froze when she saw Luca there, seated at the long table, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a lamp. He didn't look up as she entered, his attention focused on the papers spread before him. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Izzy said softly, breaking the silence. Luca glanced at her, his expression wary. "Neither do you, apparently." She hesitated, then stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her caution. "What are you working on?" "Plans," he replied simply, gesturing to the blueprints and notes scattered across the table. "Logistics for the next operation." Izzy's eyes skimmed the papers, her heart sinking as she recognized the names of locations tied to her father's company. "You really hate him, don't you?" she said quietly. Luca's gaze snapped to hers, his jaw tightening. "Your father represents everything we fight against. Greed, exploitation, power without accountability." She swallowed, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "Not everyone in his world agrees with what he does." "Maybe not," Luca said, his voice cold. "But they don't do anything to stop it, do they?" Izzy felt a pang of guilt, but held his gaze. "You don't know me, Luca. You don't know what I stand for." "No," he agreed, leaning back in his chair. "But I know what you've been part of. And until you prove otherwise, that's all I need to know." His words stung more than she cared to admit, but she didn't back down. "Maybe you should give people the chance to surprise you." Luca studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stood, gathering his papers in one swift motion. "Good night, Isabella," he said, his tone clipped. She watched him go, frustration bubbling beneath her calm facade. Luca was infuriating. Aloof, guarded, impossible to read. And yet, he fascinated her in a way she couldn't explain. Izzy sank into one of the chairs, her gaze drifting to the maps pinned to the walls. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. The lines between ally and enemy, truth and lie, were growing blurrier by the second. The morning sun poured through the farmhouse's grimy windows, casting streaks of gold across the dusty floorboards. Izzy sat at the long table, her fingers skimming the edge of a steaming mug of tea. Across from her, the group's strategist, a wiry woman named Amelia, pored over a stack of papers with sharp focus. "So," Amelia began, glancing up at Izzy with a raised brow. "You really think you can pull this off?" Izzy straightened in her chair, bristling at Amelia's skepticism. "I already did yesterday, didn't I?" Amelia snorted, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "One call doesn't make you part of the team, princess." The jab hit harder than Izzy expected, but she masked it with a tight smile. "Well, I guess I'll have to prove you wrong." Before Amelia could respond, the door swung open and Luca strode in, a leather jacket slung over his shoulder. He scanned the room, his eyes briefly locking on Izzy before shifting to Amelia. "We're moving forward with tonight's operation," Luca said, dropping a rolled-up map onto the table. "Amelia, finalize the logistics. Isabella," he turned to Izzy, his tone clipped. "You're coming with me." Izzy blinked, caught off guard. "With you? Where?" Luca didn't answer immediately. Instead, he nodded toward the map. "There's a supplier in the city we need to secure. You're better at charming people than my usual crew." Amelia frowned, clearly disapproving. "You're taking her into the field? That's risky." "So is sitting here doing nothing," Luca shot back. "She's proven useful. Let's see how far that goes." Izzy felt a mix of nerves and determination swirl in her chest. She hated being treated like a liability, but the chance to prove herself, to Luca, to Amelia, to everyone, was too tempting to pass up. "When do we leave?" she asked, standing. Luca's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. "Now." And the drive into the city was tense. Luca kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel with practiced ease. Izzy sat beside him, her gaze flitting between the passing scenery and his profile, trying to decipher the storm of emotions she sensed brewing beneath his calm exterior. "Is it always like this?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. Luca glanced at her, one brow arched. "Like what?" "The constant tension," she replied, gesturing vaguely toward the road ahead. The pressure, the risks. Luca's jaw tightened, and he returned his attention to the road. You get used to it. Izzy frowned, studying him. Do you? For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he exhaled, his grip on the wheel loosening slightly. You don't really have a choice. When you believe in something, you learn to live with the fear. The honesty in his words caught her off guard, and she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Admiration, perhaps, or understanding. And what about you? Luca asked suddenly, his voice softer but no less intense. What do you believe in, Isabella? Izzy hesitated, the question hitting harder than she expected. She wanted to answer, to tell him she believed in freedom, in carving her own path, but the words felt hollow, especially when her very presence here was rooted in lies. I don't know, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe I'm still trying to figure that out. Luca didn't respond, but the look he gave her, brief but searching, lingered in her mind long after the silence returned. They arrived at a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city, its facade blending seamlessly with the surrounding industrial sprawl. Luca led Izzy inside, his movements swift and deliberate. She followed close behind, her pulse quickening as they entered a large, dimly lit room filled with crates and machinery. A man emerged from the shadows, his build stocky and his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. He greeted Luca with a firm handshake before turning his attention to Izzy. And who's this? The man asked, his tone cautious. She's with me, Luca replied, his voice carrying an edge that left no room for argument. We're here for the shipment. The man studied Izzy for a moment longer, then nodded. It's in the back. Follow me. See, as they moved deeper into the warehouse, Izzy couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She kept close to Luca, her senses on high alert. When they reached the crates in question, the man handed Luca a clipboard, gesturing for him to inspect the inventory. You trust this guy? Izzy whispered, leaning close to Luca. Luca glanced at her, his eyes glinting with amusement. Trust is a luxury we don't have, but he's reliable enough, for now. The transaction went smoothly, but as they turned to leave, the tension in the air thickened. From the corner of her eye, Izzy spotted movement, a shadow slipping behind one of the crates. Luca! She hissed, grabbing his arm. He followed her gaze, his body tensing. Stay behind me. The next moments unfolded in a blur. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn and their faces masked. Luca moved swiftly, pulling Izzy behind a stack of crates as gunfire erupted. Stay down! He ordered, his voice sharp. Izzy's heart pounded as chaos erupted around her. She pressed herself against the cold metal, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She heard Luca return fire, his movements quick and precise, but the sound of bullets ricocheting off the walls made it clear they were outnumbered. Luca! She called out, her voice trembling. I'm fine, he shouted back. Just stay where you are. But Izzy couldn't stay still. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. Then she spotted it, a narrow passage leading to a side door, partially concealed by a stack of pallets. Luca, there! She yelled, pointing. He followed her line of sight, nodding sharply. Go! I'll cover you! Izzy hesitated, her fear rooting her in place. But the determination in Luca's voice spurred her into action. She bolted toward the passage, her heart pounding as bullets whizzed past her. She reached the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the alley beyond. Moments later, Luca appeared behind her, slamming the door shut and locking it with a heavy metal bar. His chest heaved, his face slick with sweat as he turned to her. Are you okay? He asked, his voice rough. Izzy nodded, though her hands were shaking. I think so. You? Luca gave a tight smile, but his eyes betrayed the lingering adrenaline. I've been through worse. The two of them stood there for a moment, catching their breath. Then Luca reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a fleeting, unspoken reassurance. Come on, he said finally. We need to move. As they disappeared into the shadows, Izzy couldn't shake the realization that, for the first time in her life, she'd felt something close to purpose. But at what cost? And how much deeper was she willing to go? The farmhouse was eerily quiet when they returned, their footsteps muted against the creaking floorboards. The adrenaline from the ambush still coursed through Izzy's veins, leaving her jittery and restless. Luca's silence was heavier than usual, his expression unreadable as he led her to the common room. Sit, he ordered, gesturing to a chair by the table. Izzy hesitated, her instincts bristling at his tone. Luca, what's... "Sit," he repeated, his voice cold. The sharpness of his command made her obey without another word. She perched on the edge of the chair, her pulse quickening as Luca paced in front of her. He was tense, his movements sharp and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "Mind telling me why those men at the warehouse knew exactly where we'd be?" he asked, stopping abruptly to pin her with his gaze. Izzy's breath hitched. I don't know. Maybe someone tipped them off?" "Someone did," Luca said, his voice dangerously low. "The question is, who?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Izzy's chest tightened as she scrambled for a response. "You think it was me?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "After everything I've done to help you?" Luca slammed his hands on the table, making her flinch. "What I think," he said, leaning in close, "is that you've been lying to me since the day you got here." Izzy's stomach dropped, the truth she'd buried threatening to surface. She fought to keep her composure, but the weight of Luca's stare was unbearable. "I haven't lied," she said weakly, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Don't," Luca snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult my intelligence. You're not just some runaway heiress trying to escape Daddy's control, are you?" Izzy's heart pounded as the walls of her deception closed in around her. She'd always known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to feel like this. Like the ground beneath her was crumbling, leaving her with nothing to hold on to. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Luca's eyes narrowed. "What didn't you mean, Isabella?" The use of her full name, laced with anger and betrayal, sent a shiver down her spine. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I staged my own kidnapping," she confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "To get away from my father, to escape the life he was forcing me into." For a moment, the room was silent. Then Luca let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You're telling me this entire time. You've been playing me? Playing all of us?" "It wasn't like that," Izzy protested, her voice rising in desperation. "I didn't know you'd intercept me. I didn't even know who you were until you took me. I wanted out." "Out?" Luca repeated, his tone mocking. "Out of what? Your gilded cage? Your privileged life?" "You don't understand," Izzy snapped, anger flaring in her chest. "You don't know what it's like to be trapped in a life you didn't choose, to have every decision made for you." Luca's expression darkened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice cutting. "I don't understand what it's like to have everything handed to me on a silver platter, but I do understand betrayal." The word hit her like a blow, leaving her breathless. "I never meant to betray you," she said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to be free." Luca stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mix of fury and something else, something she couldn't quite name. Then he straightened, his expression hardening. "Pack your things," he said coldly. "You're leaving tomorrow." Izzy's chest tightened in panic. "What? No, I can't." "You don't have a choice," Luca interrupted, his voice firm. "You've put this entire group at risk with your lies. You're a liability, Isabella, and I don't take risks I don't have to." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. Izzy watched helplessly as he turned and walked out of the room, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. That night, Izzy sat on the edge of her mattress, staring at the bag she'd packed with trembling hands. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, regret, and a sharp pang of loss she hadn't anticipated. She couldn't leave. Not like this. Not without fixing the mess she'd made. She stood abruptly, her resolve hardening. If Luca thought she was a liability, she'd prove him wrong. She'd find a way to earn back his trust, no matter what it took. If the opportunity came sooner than she expected. Early the next morning, Izzy overheard Amelia and another team member discussing a potential lead, a critical shipment her father's company was sending to one of its factories. It was the kind of intel Luca would act on immediately, and Izzy saw her chance to prove herself. Without waiting for permission, she slipped out of the farmhouse and headed toward the town nearby. The plan forming in her mind was risky, reckless even, but it was her only shot. If she could intercept the shipment and bring the information back to Luca, he'd have no choice but to see her value. Hours later, Izzy stood on the edge of a narrow road, her heart pounding as she watched the convoy approach. She'd bribed a local contact to delay the trucks just long enough for her to act, but now that the moment was here, doubt crept in. What if she failed? What if Luca was right, and she was nothing more than a liability? She shoved the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. As the first truck slowed to a stop, she stepped into the road, holding up a hand to signal the driver. The man leaned out of the window, his brow furrowed. "What the hell are you doing?" "I need to speak to your supervisor," Izzy said firmly, drawing on every ounce of authority she'd learned from years of navigating her father's world. "Now." The driver hesitated, but her tone left no room for argument. Moments later, a man in a suit stepped out of the second truck, his expression suspicious. "Who are you?" he demanded. Izzy squared her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Someone who knows exactly what's in those crates, and someone who's willing to make a deal." The man's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the sound of engines roared in the distance. Izzy turned, her breath catching as she saw a familiar vehicle speeding toward them. Luca. He leapt out of the truck before it came to a full stop, his expression thunderous as he stalked toward her. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, grabbing her arm. "Saving your mission," Izzy shot back, refusing to back down. "You wanted me to prove myself? Consider this my proof." Luca stared at her, his anger warring with something else, something almost like grudging respect. Then he released her arm, turning to the man in the suit. "Let's talk," he said curtly. As the two men disappeared into the shadows, Izzy felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know if she'd earned Luca's trust, but she knew one thing. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. The farmhouse was buzzing with activity when they returned. Word of Izzy's daring move had spread fast, and the reactions from Luca's team were mixed. Some murmured grudging approval. Others, like Amelia, looked ready to tear her apart. "What were you thinking?" Amelia hissed as Izzy stepped inside. "You could have gotten yourself killed. Or worse, compromised us all." "I didn't," Izzy said firmly, meeting Amelia's glare with as much confidence as she could muster. "I got the job done." "Barely," Amelia snapped. "And you're lucky Luca didn't leave you on the side of the road." Izzy's stomach tightened at the mention of Luca. Since they'd returned, he'd kept his distance, his expression unreadable and his tone clipped. He hadn't spoken to her directly, not even to reprimand her. It was infuriating. "He's in the study," Amelia added, her tone sharp. "If you have a death wish, go ahead and talk to him." Izzy didn't hesitate. She squared her shoulders and marched toward the study, ignoring the stares that followed her. Her pulse raced as she reached the door and knocked. "Come in," Luca's voice called, low and steady. She pushed the door open, stepping inside. Luca stood by the window, his back to her, the faint glow of moonlight outlining his tense frame. Papers and maps cluttered the desk, but his focus was elsewhere. "You wanted to see me?" Izzy ventured, her voice more confident than she felt. Luca turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. They were dark, unreadable, but the simmering frustration in them was impossible to miss. "What you did today," he began, his voice dangerously quiet, "was reckless. Stupid. You could have ruined everything." "But I didn't," Izzy countered, stepping closer. "I got the intel you needed. I proved I'm not just some helpless heiress." "You proved you don't know when to follow orders," Luca snapped. "You think taking risks makes you brave? It makes you a liability." The word hit her like a slap, but she refused to back down. "I did what I had to do because you wouldn't give me a chance to show what I'm capable of. And you think this changes anything?" Luca's voice rose, his anger spilling over. "You think one act of desperation erases the lies you've been telling since the day we met?" Izzy's chest tightened, but she stood her ground. "I think it shows that I'm willing to fight for this. For you. For your cause." Luca's eyes flashed with something she couldn't quite place. Anger, frustration, and maybe a flicker of something softer. He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, and Izzy felt her breath hitch. "This isn't a game, Isabella," he said quietly, his voice low and intense. "This isn't about proving yourself or earning my trust. This is about survival. And out there, survival doesn't care how brave you think you are." The words cut deep, but Izzy refused to let them break her. "Maybe not," she said, her voice steady. "But it does care how much you're willing to fight. And I'm willing, Luca. More than you realize." For a moment they stood in silence, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. Luca's gaze bore into hers, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You're impossible," he muttered, half to himself. Izzy allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. "So I've been told." Luca let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Get some rest. We've got work to do tomorrow." It wasn't exactly a truce, but it was enough. Izzy nodded, her chest loosening slightly as she turned to leave. But before she reached the door, Luca's voice stopped her. "And Isabella," he said, his tone softer now. "Don't pull a stunt like that again." She glanced back, her lips curving into a small smile. No promises. The next day, the group gathered in the main room to review the intel Izzy had secured. The intercepted shipment contained not just supplies, but critical documents detailing her father's company's upcoming projects. Projects that could devastate entire communities if left unchecked. "This is huge," Emilia admitted reluctantly, her sharp tone softened by genuine surprise. "We can use this to expose them. Or disrupt the projects before they start," Luca added, his gaze scanning the room. "Either way, we need to act fast." The group began strategizing, their energy focused and determined. Izzy sat quietly at first, listening as they debated logistics and tactics. But as the discussion unfolded, an idea began to take shape in her mind. "What if we hit their headquarters?" she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. "It's risky," she continued, her pulse quickening. "But if we can get into their central office, we could access files that aren't in the shipment, files that could expose everything," Emilia scoffed. "And how exactly do you propose we do that? Walk in and ask nicely?" "I could get us in," Izzy said, her voice steady despite the doubt in the room. "I know the building, I know the security. If we plan it right, it's possible." "You're suggesting we infiltrate one of the most secure buildings in the city," Emilia said, shaking her head. "That's insane." "Maybe," Izzy admitted, "but it's also the best chance we have to take them down for good." The room buzzed with murmurs of skepticism, but Luca remained silent, his eyes fixed on Izzy. She met his gaze, willing him to see the determination in hers. After a long moment, he spoke. "We'll consider it." Emilia opened her mouth to protest, but Luca held up a hand. "I said we'll consider it. For now, we focus on the projects in the shipment. Isabella's idea is a backup plan." Izzy felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't a full victory, but it was progress. And progress was enough. For now. That evening, as the group disbanded for the night, Izzy found herself alone on the farmhouse's back porch. The cool night air wrapped around her, the distant sounds of crickets and rustling leaves providing a rare moment of peace. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" The familiar voice made her smile, and she turned to see Luca leaning against the doorframe, his expression softer than she'd expected. "Quitting's not really my style," she replied, her tone light. Luca stepped onto the porch, his gaze sweeping over the dark horizon. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been before. "You were right," Luca said finally, his voice quiet. "About fighting for something." Izzy's breath caught, her chest tightening with a mix of surprise and emotion. "Luca, Don't get cocky," he interrupted, though his tone held a trace of warmth. "You still have a long way to go." Izzy laughed softly, the sound breaking the tension. "Fair enough." They stood there together, the night stretching out before them, their shared determination binding them closer than either cared to admit. For the first time, Izzy felt like she truly belonged, not just in Luca's world, but in the fight that was now hers as well. The farmhouse was alive with energy, a hum of tense excitement vibrating through the air. The group had spent the last 2 days finalizing their plan to intercept and disrupt her father's devastating new projects. Every detail had been scrutinized, every contingency considered. Izzy had watched it all with a mix of awe and determination, her heart swelling with pride at the team's resolve. But her mind kept drifting to Luca. Since their conversation on the porch, something between them had shifted. He was still guarded, still prone to sharp remarks and steely glares, but there was a softness in the way he spoke to her now, a flicker of something unspoken that made her pulse quicken whenever he was near. "Eyes on the mission, Laurent." Emilia's voice broke through Izzy's thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Izzy smirked, refusing to let Emilia's sharp tone rattle her. "Don't worry, I'm focused." "Good," Luca interjected, stepping into the room. His gaze swept over the group, lingering on Izzy for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Because tonight, we need everyone at their best." The weight of his words settled over them, and the room fell into silence. Izzy clenched her fists, a mix of nerves and resolve coursing through her veins. This was it, the moment she'd been working toward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the group piled into 2 unmarked vans, their destination a distribution center owned by Laurent Enterprises. It was a key hub for the project's materials, and disrupting it would deal a critical blow to her father's operations. Izzy sat beside Luca in the lead van, her heart racing as they neared the site. The air between them was charged, their unspoken connection thrumming like a live wire. Luca's hand rested on the dashboard, his fingers tapping an uneven rhythm that mirrored her own anxious energy. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice low. Izzy met his gaze, her chest tightening at the intensity in his eyes. "Always." He nodded, a flicker of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Stay close to me." Her breath hitched at the quiet command, and she forced herself to focus as the van came to a stop. Luca's hand brushed against hers briefly as he opened the door, the contact sending a jolt through her. "Let's move," he said, his tone all business now. The operation started smoothly. The team moved with practiced precision, disabling security cameras and sneaking past guards to access the distribution center's main warehouse. Izzy stayed close to Luca, her senses on high alert as they navigated the dimly lit corridors. But then something went wrong. The soft click of a radio crackled through the silence, followed by hurried footsteps and the unmistakable sound of weapons being drawn. Luca cursed under his breath, grabbing Izzy's arm and pulling her behind a stack of crates. "They know we're here," he muttered, his jaw tight. "How?" Izzy whispered, her heart pounding. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "What matters is getting out." Before she could respond, the guards appeared, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Luca signaled to the others, his hand movements quick and deliberate. The team split off, each member moving to create a distraction and draw the guards away. Luca turned to Izzy, his expression intense. "Stay with me." She nodded, her pulse thrumming as they moved through the shadows, their steps silent but urgent. The guards were closing in, their voices growing louder with each passing second. As they reached the exit, a shout rang out behind them. Izzy turned just in time to see a guard raising his weapon, his aim locked on Luca. Time seemed to slow, the air thick with tension. Without thinking, Izzy moved. She shoved Luca aside, the force of her movement knocking them both off balance. The guard's shot missed by inches, the sound reverberating through the warehouse like a thunderclap. Luca recovered quickly, his hand gripping Izzy's arm as he pulled her behind a nearby pillar. His eyes blazed with a mix of anger and something else, something raw and unguarded. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice harsh. "I was thinking you needed saving," Izzy shot back, her chest heaving. Luca's grip on her arm tightened, his expression fierce. "You could have been killed." "So could you," she countered, her voice trembling but firm. "And I wasn't about to let that happen." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. Then, without warning, Luca pulled her close, his lips crashing against hers in a kiss that was as fierce as it was desperate. Izzy's breath caught, her hands instinctively clutching his jacket as the world around them faded into nothingness. The kiss was a collision of anger and relief, fear and longing, a raw and unfiltered expression of everything they'd been holding back. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingling in the dim light, Luca's voice was a rough whisper. "You're impossible." Izzy smiled, her heart pounding. "So are you." He didn't reply, but the look in his eyes said everything. They didn't have time for more words. The sound of approaching guards snapped them back to reality, and Luca grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the exit. The aftermath of the mission was a blur. The team regrouped at a safe house on the outskirts of the city, their nerves frayed but their spirits intact. Despite the close call, they'd managed to disrupt the shipment, delaying her father's project and securing valuable intel in the process. But Izzy's thoughts were elsewhere. She sat alone in a small room, her mind replaying the kiss over and over again. She didn't know what it meant, what it changed, but she knew it had changed something. Luca was no longer just her captor, her reluctant ally. He was something more, and that terrified her. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts, and Luca stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Can't sleep?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Izzy shook her head, her chest tightening as he crossed the room to sit beside her. "Tonight was intense," she said softly, her voice betraying the emotions swirling within her. Luca nodded, his gaze steady. "You did good out there." The words warmed her more than they should have, and she found herself smiling despite everything. "So did you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the night settling over them. Then Luca reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with sincerity, "for what you did back there, for saving me." Izzy looked at him, her heart aching with an intensity she couldn't explain. "You'd do the same for me." Luca didn't reply, but the look in his eyes was answer enough. As the night stretched on, they sat together in the quiet, the unspoken connection between them stronger than ever. And for the first time, Izzy felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The tension in the air was suffocating as Izzy stood in the dimly lit safe house, surrounded by Luca's team. The documents they had secured during the last mission lay spread across the table, their contents spelling out a grim picture. Her father's company wasn't just targeting one community. It was launching a series of projects that would devastate entire regions, displacing families, and polluting the environment in the name of profit. "This is bigger than we thought," Amelia said, her voice tight as she gestured to a map covered in red markers. "If we don't stop them now, they'll be untouchable." Luca stood at the head of the table, his jaw clenched and his eyes dark with determination. He glanced at Izzy, his expression unreadable, and she felt the weight of his unspoken question. This was her family's empire they were taking on. Was she ready to face the consequences? "What's the plan?" Izzy asked, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled at her sides. Luca's gaze softened, just slightly, before he turned back to the team. "We hit their headquarters. It's risky, but it's the only way to access the data we need to expose them. If we can get into their servers and leak this to the press, they won't be able to recover." The room buzzed with murmurs of approval, but Izzy's chest tightened. The headquarters was her father's stronghold, a fortress of security and loyalty. Breaking in wouldn't just be dangerous, it would be personal. "I'll go," Izzy said suddenly, her voice cutting through the noise. Luca turned to her, his brows furrowing. "What?" "I know the building," she continued, her heart pounding. "I know the layout, the security protocols. You need me." "It's too dangerous," Luca said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I won't put you in that position." Izzy stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't have a choice. You need someone who can get you inside. Someone who can talk their way past the guards, who knows where the vulnerabilities are. That's me." Luca's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin. "You don't owe us this, Isabella." Her breath hitched at the use of her name, the raw emotion in his voice. "I do," she said softly. "This isn't just your fight anymore. It's mine too." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. After a long moment, Luca nodded, his gaze filled with both resignation and something that made her chest ache. "Fine," he said quietly, "but you follow my lead. No risks, no heroics. Understood?" Izzy nodded, her heart pounding as the gravity of her decision sank in. This was it, the final stand. They moved under the cover of darkness, their van weaving through the quiet streets of the city toward the Laurent Enterprises headquarters. The team was silent, their focus razor-sharp. Izzy sat beside Luca in the front seat, her hands clenched in her lap. "You don't have to do this," Luca said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Yes, I do," she replied, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "This is my chance to make things right." Luca didn't respond, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. He was worried, more than he wanted to admit. Izzy reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand on the gear shift. It was a small gesture, but the way his fingers curled around hers sent a wave of warmth through her. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Luca nodded, his grip tightening on hers for just a moment before he let go. So the headquarters loomed ahead, a towering glass structure that gleamed under the city lights. Izzy's stomach churned as they approached, the weight of familiarity pressing down on her. She'd spent years in this building, attending meetings, following her father's orders. Now, she was about to dismantle it from the inside. Luca parked the van a few blocks away, and the team disembarked, moving with practiced precision. Izzy adjusted her earpiece as they approached the side entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. "You ready?" Luca asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Izzy nodded, her fingers brushing against the access card she'd taken from her father's office weeks ago. "Let's do this." The entrance was guarded, but Izzy's confident smile and sharp words were enough to get them inside. She felt the guards' eyes on her as they passed, her pulse racing as she led Luca and Amelia down a series of corridors. "This way," she whispered, gesturing toward a stairwell. "The server room is 2 floors down." They moved quickly, their footsteps silent against the polished floors. But as they reached the server room, an alarm blared, the sound piercing through the air like a knife. "Damn it," Amelia muttered, pulling out her weapon. "We've been made." Guards swarmed the corridor, their shouts echoing as the team scrambled for cover. Izzy pressed herself against the wall, her chest heaving as panic threatened to overwhelm her. "Isabella, stay down!" Luca shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. She nodded, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the flash drive Luca had given her. Their mission wasn't over yet. While Luca and Amelia engaged the guards, Izzy darted toward the server room, her heart pounding as she bypassed the security measures. The room was cold and sterile, rows of servers humming with electricity. Izzy's hands shook as she inserted the drive, her fingers flying across the keyboard to initiate the data transfer. Each second felt like an eternity, the sounds of gunfire and shouting growing louder outside. "Hurry up," she muttered to herself, her breath coming in short bursts. Finally, the transfer completed, and Izzy yanked the drive free. She turned to leave, but a figure blocked her path. Her father. "Isabella," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" Her heart sank, her worst fears realized. "Stopping you," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I won't let you destroy more lives." Her father's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "You have no idea what you're meddling in." "I know enough," Izzy shot back, "and I'm done being your pawn." Before he could respond, a shadow moved behind him, and Luca appeared, his gun trained on the older man. "Move!" he ordered, his voice like steel. Her father hesitated, his gaze shifting between them. Then, with a sneer, he stepped aside, allowing them to pass. Luca grabbed Izzy's hand, pulling her toward the exit. They ran together, the weight of their actions pressing down on them as they navigated the chaos. When they finally reached the van, breathless and shaken, Luca turned to her, his expression fierce. "You're insane!" he said, his voice a mix of frustration and admiration. "But you did it." Izzy managed a shaky smile, her chest tightening as she looked at him. "We did it." As the van sped away from the headquarters, the weight of their victory and the sacrifices they'd made to achieve it settled over them. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were in this together. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The team sat around the table, their faces marked by exhaustion and triumph. The mission had been a success. The files Izzy had extracted from her father's servers were already making waves in the media, exposing decades of corruption and exploitation. Laurent Enterprises was reeling, and her father's power was crumbling. But victory felt bittersweet. Izzy stood by the window, her arms crossed as she gazed out at the quiet countryside. The adrenaline from the night before had faded, leaving her with a strange emptiness. She had done what she set out to do. She had fought back, broken free from her father's control. So why did it feel like something was still missing? "Penny for your thoughts?" Luca's voice broke through her reverie, and she turned to see him leaning against the doorframe, his expression soft. Izzy managed a faint smile. "You don't strike me as the type to waste money on pointless questions." "Fair enough," he said, stepping closer. "How about a trade then? I'll tell you what's on my mind if you tell me what's on yours." She arched a brow, tilting her head. "Deal. You first." Luca hesitated, his dark eyes searching hers. "I was thinking about last night, about how close we came to losing everything, and how much it scares me to think about losing you." Izzy's breath caught, her heart pounding at the raw honesty in his words. "Luca, Wait," he interrupted gently, holding up a hand. "Let me finish. I've spent years fighting this fight, telling myself that I couldn't afford distractions, that I couldn't let anyone in because it made me weak. But you," he shook his head, a small, rueful smile tugging at his lips. "You make me stronger, Isabella, and that scares the hell out of me." Her chest tightened, the weight of his confession pressing against her own emotions. She stepped closer, reaching out to take his hand. "You don't have to be scared," she said softly, "because I'm not going anywhere. I'm with you, Luca. In this fight, in whatever comes next, I'm all in." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with unspoken promises. Then Luca cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm, and kissed her. It was slow and deliberate, a kiss that spoke of trust and hope, and everything they'd fought so hard to find. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Laurent Enterprises continued to unravel as the media exposed scandal after scandal. Communities once silenced by fear began to rise, demanding justice. Luca's team worked tirelessly to ensure the momentum didn't falter, their efforts bolstered by the files Izzy had secured. Izzy found herself at the center of it all, navigating interviews and meetings with a determination that surprised even her. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was making a difference, not as her father's daughter, but as herself. But the work wasn't without its challenges. Her father had gone into hiding, his empire fractured, but not yet defeated. There were whispers of retaliation, of alliances forming to regain what had been lost. Izzy knew the fight was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Izzy and Luca sat on the farmhouse's porch, the quiet hum of cicadas filling the air. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that felt like a promise of better days. "What happens now?" Izzy asked, leaning against Luca's shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "We keep fighting," he said simply, "but we do it together." Izzy smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of contentment and determination. Together sounds good. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey settling between them like an old friend. Izzy knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainty. But for the first time, she felt ready, because she had found something worth fighting for: love, freedom, and the chance to build a life on her own terms. And as Luca's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining, she knew she had found her new beginning. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. She married a billionaire to save her family's legacy. But what she didn't expect was to really fall in love for this type of man. A contract with no romance, no trust, no nothing. Just business. But everything started to crumble.